This will be our final lecture, the sixth in our series on Don Marquis's Why Abortion is Immoral. And in this lecture, we are going to be considering some potential objections and ways in which one could respond to the objections. So one really important thing to do in a good philosophical essay is to think critically about how somebody might object to the claims that you are making, and then how someone might respond, how you as the author could respond. So that's the basic idea that we're going to pursue in this lecture. All right, so someone might argue that a necessary condition for one's future to be valuable is that someone values it. This is the first basic objection that Marcus considers at the end of his essay. And so the basic idea here is that, sure, yeah, we might have a valuable future, and that might be a reason why it'd be wrong to kill people, but that requires that somebody values it. Somebody values the future. So in other words, value implies a valuer. But the fetus is not the sort of thing that can value their own life. The fetus doesn't value much of anything. And so it's not clear then why it would be morally wrong to kill the fetus, even if what Marcus is saying has thus far been something we'll accept. So how does Marcus respond to this particular kind of objection? He thinks that we should accept that it's true for something to have or to be valued, that there must be someone who values that thing. So he accepts this claim that value implies a valuer. He doesn't think, however, that it follows that my life is not valuable unless I am the one who values it. So maybe my life could have value even if I don't value it. Maybe somebody else values it, something along those lines. So consider a case where someone is thinking about suicide. Well, in a case of suicide, presumably they do not value their own life, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be a case of suicide. It could be true that they still have a valuable future life. We can imagine a case where someone attempts or is thinking about taking their own life as, say, a very young person, and so they don't value their life, let's say at the age 20, but later they grow up and in fact do value their life. Maybe they do quite a bit. Maybe they go on to give talks about how suicide is something we should be more concerned with. And so it looks like they do have a valuable future, even though earlier on at the age of, say, 20, they did not actually value their own life to them. Another objection that Marcus considers is one that's offered by Tooley. Tooley objects by claiming that the right to life, that is going to be grounded on a desire to live, right? So the fetus does not have a right to life because the fetus does not actually desire to live. Well, Marcus's general response here is just simply to appeal to what he already discussed with regard to the desired count of the wrongness of killing, right? Remember that Marcus thought that the desire count was going to have to give both necessary and sufficient conditions for why it's wrong to kill, whereas his account only gives sufficient conditions. And if we weaken the desire count such that it only gives sufficient conditions, then it no longer appears to be a rival account to the valuable future life like ours account. And so Marcus essentially thinks that that's the best way that we can respond to Tooley's objection, is simply to appeal to what we already discussed when we were thinking about how the desire count could be a plausible rival. And so he thinks that's sufficient to reject this objection as well. Another way that somebody might object is offered by a philosopher named Basson. And that objection basically claims that the embryo cannot be a victim and therefore cannot be wronged in the way required by the account that Marcus offers. So what would that mean? That embryo is not the sort of thing that can be a victim. Well, it's because in order to be a victim, one must be at least, at minimum, sentient. If sentience basically means that you have the ability to sort of perceive or be aware of your environment around you, maybe to have pain, or maybe to notice, certain changes in your environment, your interactions with the environment, then it's not clear that at least earlier on, when the fetus is just merely an embryo, that would be wrong in that case. No more than it would be, or maybe it would be wrong to kill like an ant or a plant or something along those lines. Marx's response is to say that the difference between a plant or a rock and an embryo is that the latter but not the former is the kind of thing that has the potential for sentience. So it's a potential person. A plant, a rock is not a potential person. No matter how it might develop, it's never going to become a person. The embryo actually is a potential person. So that's the way he responds to that objection. We're going to come back to this notion of potential persons. But first, let's ask the question, does Marcus's account entail that contraception would be just as seriously morally wrong as killing you or me? This was something that we did kind of bring up in a previous video, but let's think about it in more detail here. If it actually is the case that Marcus's account entails that contraception is morally wrong, then this looks like a pretty strong reason to reject the account, since intuitively it seems absurd to say that contraception is just as morally problematic as killing you or me. Marcus thinks that his view is not vulnerable to this objection. And that's because the contraception objection involves possible people or possible fertilized ovum, where it's not actually a person yet. It's not actually a fertilized ovum. It's just possible. So what Marcus wants to say is that on his view, it's got to involve actual people and actual fertilized ovum. It can't be the sperm by itself or the ovum by itself. It has to be an actual fertilized ovum that is going to count as being the sort of thing that can have a future life like ours. Not a possible one. Really what's going on here, it looks like, is a distinction between actual potential persons and possible potential persons. So a potential person is something that could have a future life like ours. And so he thinks that it's an actual fertilized ovum, an actual embryo that counts as an actual potential person, but a possible potential person isn't the sort of thing that can be harmed. It's not the sort of thing that could lose out on a future like ours in the way that killing you or me would. But I'm not sure that that's going to work for what he has to say. So consider a case where we intuitively think that certain things that we might do now here in the actual world will likely cause a lot of severe harms to people in the future. Folks that might live a long time from now, maybe 100 years from now. I'm thinking of, the sort of cases that might involve like climate change or population or future technologies that we might develop. Just focus on climate change. It seems like one of the reasons why people find climate change to be such a morally relevant issue is not merely because it could harm actual people, but because it could harm possible people in the future, maybe hundreds of years from now, maybe 1,000 years from now. But those are just possible people, not actual people. And why would it be wrong to do certain things now that cause these severe harms regarding climate change to possible people a couple hundred years from now? Well, it's because if Marx's view is right, then it's because it would be depriving them of a valuable future life like ours. That's the essence of the wrongness of killing. But those are possible people. They're not even fertilized ovum yet. So it looks like we can harm people in the future, possible people, and that's something that we need to, that's a point that the wrongness of killing should be able to account for. And it's not clear that Marx's view can. And if we do think that these possible people, not just merely actual people, we do think that those possible people hundreds of years from now can be harmed, and it's because, they have a valuable future like ours, well, then it looks like the problem of contraception is one that is going to count as a counterexample to Marx's view. But we might go a step further, right? We might think that it's not just contraception that would be entailed by his view as being morally problematic, but we might also think we have a moral obligation to procreate, right? If possible people can be harmed, then we probably should be doing everything we can to create as many of those possible people as we possibly can. So you might say that abstinence is just as morally wrong as killing you or me. And that looks absurd, right? It looks absurd to say that when I choose not to procreate, when I'm engaging in abstinence, that I'm doing something just as morally seriously wrong as I would be if I killed you, right? So this is the notion of procreation in general. Is there an obligation to procreate or to abstain from abstinence? That looks extremely problematic to us. And Marcus does not really address this objection, but if you think that the distinction that he's relying on between actual potential persons and possible potential persons is a relevant one, I feel like we have good reason to think it is, then his account should be able to respond to this objection, and it's not clear how he's going to. What about old age? This is another kind of a problem that people point to with regard to Marx's account. It's a point that it looks like his account entails, and it's not clear how he could respond to it. But the basic idea here is that Well, then what about someone who generally lacks a future life of value? Is it wrong to kill them? Take, for example, the kind of case I'm thinking of is someone who's 99 years old. They've only got maybe a year or two left to live. Is it just as wrong to kill them as it would be to kill someone who's 10 years old? Someone who's 10 years old might have another 80 or 90 years of life left. That's a whole lot of a life of value. So it looks like it would be worse, morally speaking, to kill the 10-year-old than it would be to kill the 99-year-old. Now, you might just bite the bullet and say, yep, that my view entails that, and that's just something I have to live with. Or you might think that no, killing the 99-year-old is just as morally wrong as it is to kill the 10-year-old. In fact, you might think that intuitively, it's equally bad to kill someone who's 99 or 70 or 50 or 40 or what have you, as it would be to kill their young child. It's not clear how we can say that on Marcus's view. On Marcus's view, it looks like there's degrees of wrongness. The less you have of a valuable future life, the less problematic, morally speaking, it would be to kill you. And that just intuitively seems absurd, right? So according to Marcus's count, wrongness of killing is what matters, is focused on one's future of value. If you don't have much of the future life of value, then it's not as wrong to kill you. It's not clear how Marcus is going to respond to this, but clearly if a child has more of a future life of value than the 99-year-old, then it looks like killing the child would be worse than the 99-year-old. And we need some way to respond to that because that just simply seems absurd. So this might work as a counter example to Marcus's view. There might be ways to respond. So again, remember that Marcus thought that his view was going to give a sufficient condition for the wrongness of killing, but not a necessary condition. So he might try to say that there is some other reason why it's just as wrong to kill the 99-year-old, as it would be to kill the young child. But he hasn't given that. So it's up to the proponent of his view to then offer some independent reason.